Okay, so my name is Maria Kochis, and I'm a humanities librarian and a writer, a wilderness enthusiast, wildlife enthusiast. So I'll go ahead and I'll read my short story because I think it'll take all of 15 minutes, and then introduce my panel. So thank you all for coming. My story is called The Brightest Thing Under the Moon. Is this okay, or is it too loud, too resonant? Is all right? All right. Okay. When the old lady I was traveling with threw her boots into the lake, we were 9 miles away from the main trail. The last part of our trek up the steep slope was treacherous, the pine needles glistening like ice in the sun, and she leaned on me heavily. It took us the best part of the morning to get there, to this lake she'd come to so long ago, and how we would get back now with the old lady bootless and the day turned, I just didn't know. I'd been watching some pale-winged hawks circling above the pines when I heard what sounded like 2 fish jumping, or maybe 2 frogs. Plop, plop. I turned around, hoping to see them, whatever had made that lazy summer noise, but all I saw were spreading ripples, and then noticed that the old lady's legs were now dangling in the water and that her boots were not beside her, or anywhere to be seen. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, fear making me slow-witted, behind the times, because it was obvious she had already done it. A little smile played on her lips. They were bothering me. And then I was stripping off my clothes, just like she suggested I do not 5 minutes before, and running into the lake, falling in and stroking toward the nearest circle of ripples, diving and kicking with all my might, my hands stretched in front of me. I'd met the old lady 1 week ago. She was the 5th and last driver to pick me up, if you don't count the stinking trucker from the Poconos who took me 40 mountain miles in the wrong direction, which I didn't. She'd picked me up just outside of Lander. I was clutching my thermos of coffee in one hand, my cardboard sign in the other. A few seconds after her battered pickup passed me by, I heard it crunch through the gravel of the shoulder. I watched it reversing for a full minute, then picked up my pack and ran. "Today's your lucky day," she said when I opened the door. "How's that?" "We're both headed to the same place." She nodded, but didn't smile back. To be honest, I was a little shocked to see how old she was, her hair whiter than dry shell, and her face a patchwork of delicate lines. I was still playing with the seatbelt, which had one of those old-fashioned kind of buckles, heavy in the hand, which you have to manually tighten, when she put the truck in a gear. Bobby McGee was on the radio, and soon the old lady was singing. She had a singer's voice, or used to. You could hear the loveliness in certain words. Harpoon, for instance. McGee. But in between, it cracked and rasped like harbor ice in the spring. Why didn't I take that as a warning? Me, who had spent his whole life around quays. Instead of nestling into the bucket seat of that truck that smelled like 100 old cigars and watching the sunrise coming fast over the plains, blood the mountains. We had our first real conversation in a diner in Dubois. Only then, our steak and eggs in front of us, and 2 steaming mugs of coffee in chipped enamel mugs, did she ask how long was I on the road. 8 days, counting the day I started. She speared a forkful of eggs, chewed and regarded me. "Your first time out west?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're from Baltimore?" "Richmond. That's in Virginia, but I started hitching in Boston." "I think I know where Richmond is, son." Her eyebrows arched, and I half believed the conversation was over, and maybe my free ride as well, so I ducked my head, which in my family is the way you ask for pardon. This only helped to amuse her, the very ends of her mouth tightening up, and her hand with its mug freezing on its way to her mouth, as if she could laugh or move, but not both at the same time. The old lady's eyes were a very intense shade of blue, somewhere between the color of a jay's wing and a certain weedy star-shaped flower that grew up along the roadsides of Virginia. Although I know now, having hiked the Yellowstone, that they're more like the blue of mountain gentians. The whites, as they often would be, were faintly bloodshot, which I mistakenly thought came from too many hours on the road. What about you, I wanted to ask. Where are you from? But didn't, not then or later. Although I found out a lot of other things, that she'd been married and had once owned a ranch, that her truck, Old Blue, had belonged to her husband, a copious smoker and a poet, that she'd lived with him in China, Cambridge, and Wyoming, not necessarily in that order, and that this trip had been on her mind, if not in the works, a good long while. Not so with me. The idea first spoke to me in the morning after I got fired from my job as a caddy. I was lying in bed at the time and thought I smelled something sweet. Not candy sweet or pie sweet, more like cut hay, a field deeply familiar with horses. Virginia sweet, country sweet. I closed my eyes, expecting to dream of home. Less than 2 hours later, I found myself straddling the median of one of Boston's busiest intersections. My sign, red magic marker on cardboard, said Lamar Valley, Yellowstone. I didn't bother to write Wyoming. The ignorant person who didn't know where Yellowstone was could just pass right on by. Cars honked, drivers waved, grinned, shouted, and gave me their thumbs up. The whole thing had a festival feeling, although that may have been due to the alcohol still juicing my veins. Leroy, Joins, and I had a night on the town. Given all that traffic and all that approval, it took me a long time to get picked up. But that was okay, because the driver who did was fast and purposeful, and before the day was out, we'd crossed 4 state lines and I'd had my first ride ever in a Lamborghini. After we left the diner, the old lady told me she wanted a nap for a while and I would have to drive. There's a map in the glove box. Just head west on 26. When you hit the Tetons, wake me up. She pressed the keys into my hand and then tucked up into the passenger seat, resting her head on a pillow folded in two. The last time I drove an old truck was my Uncle Pete's 20-acre farm when the tobacco was coming in, but that was on dirt with a full bed. I didn't have a car in Boston. Every time I went home, I took the train, so this was new. This felt special, driving Old Blue on that open-range highway, the old lady snoring beside me. I sang under my breath, soft and low. If you need to assign blame for what happened next, blame the mountains. My attention began to waver, to bounce back and forth from the road to the spires, playing hide and seek with the pines. The road made a sharp turn to the right. The first person to stop was a tourist from New Jersey. He and his family, a wife and 3 pigtail daughters, were on their way to Old Faithful. I saw the imprint of his daughters' noses on the windows, the muddy smears of their fingers. The tourist and I had pushed the truck off the tree and then angled it onto the widest portion of the highway's shoulder. The old lady tried to give him $20 as he was leaving, but he just thrust his hands into the air like she was pulling a gun on him, backing away at the same time. She handed me a tarp to spread on the ground, then went to the back of the truck and began rummaging around for her tools. A screwdriver, wrench, pliers, ratchets, a scraper, and a drip pan. Coolant, distilled water, a bottle of epoxy. First thing we do is disconnect the battery cable. This protects us from shocks. Then we drain the coolant. She handed me a wrench and pointed at the valve. What are we going to do? We're going to fix the crack in the radiator. If there's more than one, we'll fix them all. Then we're going to see about that tire. I did all the actual work, but the old lady talked me through everything, pointing things out in great detail, as if this was a certain stop in my future, doing a radiator repair job in the middle of nowhere with my own 2 hands and the tools I had with me. I wasn't crazy about staying there overnight, but we had to, in order for the epoxy to cure. Her tent was green canvas and smelled like camp smoke and mothballs and pitch, and my tent was orange and brand new. They looked cozy enough, lit from inside with our flashlights. The old lady turned hers off first. I stayed up reading the big, two-hearted river. I thought I was done making mistakes for that day. Peter. Yes, ma'am. I thought you were sleeping. You're not eating in your tent, are you? I didn't say anything, just stopped mid-chew. A minute later, she had unzipped the door, taking everything in. The well-endowed mermaid on my shoulder, the Snickers bar in my hand, the second of 2. Son, are you stupid? She didn't wait for an answer, just snatched the chocolate and left, but not before kicking my boot into the trees. I picked up my book again. It was a good place to pick it up, with Nick on the verge of landing his first trout. But the story was closed to me now. my attention given over to the sounds of the forest, the hoots and woos and snaps, the dark rustlings and the sudden, spooky silences. In the morning, Old Blue started right up. We drove through the Tetons and entered Yellowstone from the south. The old lady was going to drop me off at Slough Creek, one of the campgrounds of the Lamar, but first she had to stop by the ranger station to pick up her permit. This seemed strange to me, that you had to make a reservation to be in the wilderness, the way you do for a hotel, but the old lady said that's the way it had to be now. Otherwise, the backcountry would all too quickly fill up with people. The ranger station was in a dinky little building, a cabin with a roof that needed repairs, but the ranger behind the desk looked official enough. He had a creased button-down shirt, a sharp handsomeness. The old lady gave him a permit number, and he pulled up a reservation. Penelope Jackson? The old lady affirmed it. He'll be hiking 34 miles from the Lamar River Trailhead to Pelican Valley, starting today, finishing on the 14th. There was a map of northern Yellowstone under the glass on the table, which faced visitors, and the ranger traced the route with his finger. Is that Heart Lake? The old lady tapped the glass. No, ma'am, that's Bobcat Lake. Heart Lake is over here. If you're planning on going there, I should warn you, that trail is no longer maintained. I was there years ago with my husband. 50 years. We took horses, our own. Her head stayed bent, as if their figures were imposed on the map, and she could see them winding up the trail with their horses and saddlebags, her with her young long hair, and her husband with broad shoulders, a horseman's way of leaning back in the saddle. Ma'am? Do you have any way to communicate if you get in trouble? A sat phone or a PLB? The old lady's head snapped up. No, I don't. Is that required nowadays? It's not required, no. Good. I'd like my permit now, please. Ma'am? What? Are you sure you're able to make this trip? I sucked in my breath. Now he was in for it. But instead of flashing her eyes at him, growing fiercer and bigger, the old lady seemed to shrink, her very bones dwindling beneath her coat. If only you weren't going alone, the ranger said. I had been loitering by the books and field guides, but now I stepped up to the desk. But she's not going alone. The ranger frowned. I didn't think the two of you were together. He looked over at his computer, and there's only one name on the permit. Well, we are together. We've been together since Lander. We made a fire and baked potatoes in tinfoil and ate them with smoked sausage that the old lady cut up into slices. I'd found a bottle of brandy wrapped in an emergency blanket at the bottom of my pack. The old lady had snuck it in, so we drank that as well. After we finished eating, she took out a pipe. I think the first question she put to me was if my parents were divorced. No, ma'am. They just celebrated their silver last August. Any brothers or sisters? No, but I have 17 first cousins living in the county. That's a big family. I guess. The funny thing is they're all women. Really? Her laugh was like the sharp bark of a fox. Yeah, my mother sent me to college in Boston to get away from their influence. I have one male cousin, Squirrel, but he's only a second cousin and lives all the way down in Oxford, Mississippi, ma'am. Girlfriend? The old lady inhaled, and the tobacco in her pipe glowed and crackled. She looked at me slyways. The girls must love you. This is the kind of thing I've been hearing all my life, the last from that school teacher from Kentucky. I ended up telling the old lady about her, how she'd stopped for me outside a Dairy Queen in Erie, Pennsylvania. She was on her way to Iowa City to visit her father, afflicted with cancer. At some point, we pulled off into an all-night truck stop and shared a joint in the parking lot, and I felt as close to her as I'd ever felt to anyone. Just before sunrise, she said she needed to sleep and found a motel. She wanted me to stay with her, just snuggle on the bed, but I knew that's not how things would go. She went inside the office to book the room, and I walked back to the highway. Not 5 minutes went by before I was picked up by a long-haul trucker from Sacramento who carried me all the way to Lander, over 1,000 miles of conservative talk radio interrupted by heavy metal. Do you like boys? the old lady asked quietly when I was finished. No, ma'am, not the way you mean. So why didn't you stay with her, show her a good time? This teacher from Kentucky who probably bought school supplies with her own money. It wasn't that she wasn't pretty, because she was. She had on a blue and green check blouse with a low neck, her breasts puffing out, and a tiny gold cross hanging between them. A giggle as light and free as blowing bubbles. I figured we would never see each other again, that's why. And I think she might have been over 30. The old lady took the bottle by the neck and walked to the edge of the river, leaving me alone to mend the fire. And even though I worried she would slip and fall on the rocks and it would be my fault, I knew better than to go after her. The look she laid on me had been so cold, so full of contempt. Our second day walking, we had a close call. The old lady stopped suddenly, held up one hand. Do you hear that? What? Ravens. Soon we began to see even bigger birds, vultures of some kind, rising and falling in their spiral of doom, the wind blowing with us and strong. We climbed a hill so long it felt like a pass, but it wasn't, because on the other side the land leveled out. 100 yards away, just off the trail, a hairy hump where some beast had finally met its tipping point. One raven perched on top of it. The others puddled around its legs. The stink of the thing hit us then, and the old lady turned and gave me a great push. Go. We left the trail and followed the river to camp. To our surprise, it was occupied by 4 women. They had come from the direction we were headed, and the first thing the old lady did was tell them about the carcass, so they knew to walk the river out. One of the girls had billows of soft brown hair and the other dready blonde, her eyes sparkling like the winter Atlantic. We ate around a common fire, drank scotch, played rummy and bullshit. All day I'd been turning it over, this idea that I was honor-bound to please women, and that even young women, which these were, just a few years older than me, and no deviants like my cousins, deserved to be pleased. Under the stars of that rare night, I was solicitous to them all, pouring their drinks, paying them compliments, laughing into their eyes. And when they encouraged me, after I'd drunk a good bit of scotch, calling attention to my own exploits in a way I'd always been too bashful to do, standing up and telling my stories, letting the light of the flames lick my face, the old lady, from her place in the shadows, smoking her pipe and nodding. In the pale morning, I crawled out of my tent, intending just to piss, and saw the old lady frying bacon near the ruins of the fire. I got dressed, jeans over my thermal underwear, my hat with the furry ear claps. The stump I sat down was hoary with frost. Listen, she said, I have an idea. What's that? I picked up my thermos. The old lady liked her coffee the way I liked mine. No cream or sugar, and so hot it burned the tongue. You should go with those girls, back down the Lamar. You can drive Old Blue to Pelican Valley, pick me up at the trailhead. That way we don't have to scrounge for a ride when we're already tired. Her eyes watered in the cold. A pink wool scarf wrapped her head like a turban. I wondered if she'd lost her hat. Better yet, forget about me. I'll take a page out of your book. Hitch back to Old Blue. You stick with those girls. It might be the trip of your life. She cackled softly. That she could let go of me so easily. I'm going with you. And then, because I couldn't sit there any longer, I walked back to my tent and started to pack. Soon after we broke camp, we came across a bison head. Where the eye should have been was a pure black hole, but patches of tough, leathery skin still clung to the skull. The old lady, guessing at my fear, told me not to worry. That bison had died a long time ago, all the meat gnawed out. Nothing was coming for it now. At the end of the day, the trail unfurled into a mile-long meadow, a meadow so beautiful it seemed like a mirage. Golden grasses and russet sedges and the dark firs framing it. The meadow was longer than it was wide, and on the other side of it was Miss Creek Pass, and over the pass, Pelican Valley. We cut over toward the east side of the meadow, where the land rose up and the forest began. On our way, we met a stream. The stream was so narrow, I could have leapt across it and only maybe fell in. Instead, I threw my boots across, hitched up the cuffs of my pants, and stepped off the muddy bank into the cold, knee-deep water where moments ago golden fish had been lazing, lipping insects. The old lady's hand, trembling as I took it, dry as bark. We set up our tents just inside the trees to avoid the frost. Afterward, the old lady spread out a blanket, sitting down to glass the meadow for hawks and sandhill cranes, and I went exploring. The meadow fluttered with birds. It showed me its bones. Most of them were deer skulls or elk skulls. I couldn't tell the difference. Sometimes they only went as far as the nose holes and stopped, which made them look like masks, as if death was something that could be tried on. One radiant skull still had its antlers attached, and was such a thing of beauty, I took the other beautiful things I'd been carrying in my pocket, 2 crystals, blue-violet at the base, and set them down where its eyes used to be. I also came across the leg bone of a much bigger animal, like something out of a cartoon about cavemen. I picked it up to feel its heft. The bone was yellow, not white, and rust-colored around the knobs. The thud, when it hit the earth, was the sound that turned me around. That night, the campfire spitting up sparks in the dry, cold air, the old lady began talking about her long-ago trip to Heart Lake. Her husband fished and wrote poetry, and she collected plant life and wove it into baskets. One of the baskets was shaped like a deep pocket, like the elaborate nest of an oriole. She made it out of grass and ephemera, threading some of their hair into the weave. And fragile though it was, the basket stood the test of time and still nested in her bedroom today. Halcyon days, and what made them even better, what made them really special, was the fact that the trip hadn't come at the beginning of their marriage, but 7 years in, after they had known each other for a right long while. Afterward, when their marriage had gone wrong, in several ways a marriage could go wrong, but never enough to break it, she would remember Heart Lake. She'd always thought they would return. "Don't go alone into the dark of old age, Peter," the old lady said to me. The last clear thing I remember her saying before the drink got hold of me completely. It was our 3rd and final night camping, so the remainder of the brandy had to go. Close to dawn, I had a dream. In my dream, I saw the old lady's bowed back hurrying through the mists of the forest. I wanted to go after her, but felt paralyzed, the way you do in dreams, and could only watch her grow more remote. Then I woke up. It was still dark, and I needed to take a piss. When I was done, I went over to the old lady's tent and bent down so I could hear her snoring and feel comforted. She was an all-night snorer. Sometimes I heard a rusty saw coming from her tent, and sometimes the soft snuffle of an animal. This time, even though I was holding my breath, I heard nothing, so I walked around to the other side of her tent, where she normally kept her boots, just to reassure myself, and found her boots missing. That's when I saw it, the white flash of her miner's light, there, and then gone. It took me a long time to catch up with her. When I did, I only followed her from a distance, respecting her privacy, I suppose, or because I was scared she would send me away. The night paled, the trees took on their dark shapes. She wasn't just stumbling through the forest blind, she was keeping to a trail, the ghost of one. The saw cuts of old tree fall told me that, and other trees still standing bore the old-fashioned blaze, a square notch of yellow wood where the bark wouldn't grow. But it wasn't a crisp trail anymore. Plants fuzzed the edges, and newer trees, felled by rot or storm, hadn't been cleared away. The old lady stayed on course, neither pausing nor backtracking, which was merely astonishing, since if I stared too hard at the trail, it tended to disappear. Around midday, I found her sitting on a rock at the edge of an avalanche field. She turned and looked straight at me, and I realized she knew I had been there all along. From then on, we hiked together. As the morning wore down, she used me more, so that by the time we climbed the last steep slope, she was leaning on me heavily, and we were slow as molasses. Here was the spot where they gathered mushrooms, and here was where Henry had set up his hammock, between these exact two trees. Here was where they had set up their kitchen, far away from where they slept. Grizzly sign all around, and they didn't want to get eaten. Here was the mossy idol, where Henry read her his poetry, and here was the spot where he had said he loved her more than the moon. The tree branch where they hung up their clothes before entering the water, night after night. In telling it, her eyes glittered, and her laugh was the soft, high titter of a girl. Finally, she sank down onto the stony beach and was quiet for a time, only once in a while suggesting I take off my clothes and go for a swim. I surfaced, gasping and empty-handed. Her old leather boots must have sunk like 2 stones. On shore, I brushed the water off my body with my hands and dressed quickly. "Don't you move from here," I said, my voice shaking, whether for "Don't you move from here," I said, my voice shaking, whether from anger or fear, I didn't know. "I'm going for help. Probably they'll send horses." Right before I left to scramble down the mountain, I turned around. How was it that not just the old lady's hair, but the long planes of her face looked so bright? Were they lit up by the sun, the cloudy light of the aspen ringing the shore? Even the flowers of her eyes had been swallowed. My hands flew up and I waved, one of those big arcing waves people leaving on a ship give to their loved ones on shore. But the old lady just sat there so still, and eventually I had to leave her. At camp, I packed quickly, only my things. The old lady's tent I left alone and didn't look at. When I reached the main trail, I knew I'd been had. No decision of mine had ever really mattered. I could turn my back on everyone, but the choice upon me now, whether to tell what had happened or do nothing, let the old lady decide her own fate, would stain me in a permanent way, mark who I'd become. I didn't want that, wasn't ready for that, and the shock of this discovery filled me with a two-fisted anger, so that I didn't see him until he was nearly upon me, the ranger with his flat-brimmed hat, the buttons of his gray shirt sparking in the setting light of the sun. Thank you. Okay. So we have our panel. So correct my pronunciation if it's wrong, okay? Yvonne Pepin-Wakefield, also publishes under Yvonne Wakefield, is a writer and artist who lives and works on Oregon's shore of the Columbia River. She's the author of Babes in the Woods, Building a Life One Log at a Time, Babes in the Woods, Self-Portrait, and the soon-to-be-released Babe in the Woods, Path of Totality, the last in these series, and Suitcase Filled with Nails, Lessons Learned from Teaching Art in Kuwait. Bridget Farr is an author, actor, and educator. Previously a middle school English teacher, she now serves as the principal at a public elementary school. Bridget is the author of 2 middle grade novels and an accomplished theater actor and producer. Her debut young author's novel, The Truth About Everything, launches in October 2022. Born and raised in eastern Montana, she now lives in Austin, Texas with her husband, Shiva, and the neighboring cat, Sherman. And so the panel discussion is off the grid. Before I ask any questions, do you both have anything you want to say about off-the-grid living or off-the-grid writing?
Well, we were chosen because we approach living off the grid from different poles. Mine was when I was 18, I went and bought 80 acres in the wilderness in Oregon with absolutely no knowledge of how to build a log cabin, and started to build a log cabin and eventually lived there. And this was during the time where there were no cell phones. It was at the end of a wilderness road. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles. At that time, I didn't have a truck. I backpacked in everything. And I continue to this day to live that way. And living that way has really taught me how to limit the resources that I use on a daily basis. So for instance, I do have running water at the cabin. You get 2 buckets and you run down to the creek and you scoop them up. Okay. So I was just up there last weekend, and I kind of ran out of water, and I didn't feel like going down to the creek to get another bucket. So you limit how much water you use to brush your teeth, right? Or to wash your face. And then I have a brand new state-of-the-art studio, gallery, and home in the Dalles, Oregon, where you turn on the water and you pay $130 a month for it. And I never even register my use of water on there. So my use of resources differs and changes my mentality depending on where I am. And I believe Bridget's story goes the opposite way.
Yeah, I would say for yours, off the grid felt like freedom, where in my story, it's about the daughter of anti-government, end-of-times preppers who've moved off the grid in a state of fear. And so for her, that living without water, trying to grow your own food is not going well. Her family was not equipped to do that, and it becomes a place that's really stifling, and then it starves her. Physically, she's malnourished, but it also starves her knowledge and what she knows about the world, and that becomes very scary for her as things happen in her life that make her aware of how much she doesn't know. And so that piece unites them, that her family, I think, went off the grid like Yvonne did, hoping that it was going to be a utopia for them, that they would have this positive experience, and it really turns.
Thanks a lot. Great. It helps put it in context. So Yvonne, how did you feel as if that continued off-the-grid living lent itself to an artistic life?
How it led to an artistic life? Well, in the beginning, I kind of pioneered university without walls. So I was able to do my college coursework up at the cabin. Okay, and you have to realize I'm doing it by kerosene lamplight all the time. But while I was building, there was no time to do my art, to do sketching. I did keep a journal, kind of like I just heard the talk about Ted Kandinsky. Like I've got like reams and reams and reams of journals, but they don't talk about anything bad. So the first time when the first snow came, and I said, okay, well, I have a watercolor assignment I have to mail in to my art instructor in Minneapolis. And I got really into it. Like, I'm painting, and I go down to wash my brushes. And of course, you have to take the water up from the creek every time, and you have to pound a hole in the creek through the ice to get the water. Well, I washed my brushes, and then the water didn't drain into the sink. So I just said, oh, I'll deal with it later. And so I finished my painting only to realize that the pipe had frozen. And I should have not been painting. I should have gone and tried to do the maintenance I should have done. So that was a resource. Like, you cannot always stop and drop and do what you want to do in an artistic way. Later, the first book, Babe in the Woods Self-Portrait, is about the first year I built the log cabin when I was 18 and stayed up there. And the second book Babe in the Woods self-portrait, which just came out, chronicles the next few years after that, where I had either a really good job that allowed me June, July, August off, or I was in school, so I would take the summers off. So it chronicles 3 summers that I spent up there. During that time, I was also an art student, and once the cabin was built and I had a secure foundation to call home and I had a roof over my head and I had figured out how I could live successfully in the woods despite the bears, I started to actualize myself as a painter. And I got a French easel. Do you know those? They look like a box and you can fold them out. And I had backpack straps grommeted to it. So I'd like pack around in the wilderness and paint. And it also allowed me the time to actually really read about other artists and their lives and look at their art as opposed to being in an art history classroom where name this slide, name this date, name this artist. So the experience, and it still does, I still go up there to kind of flush my head out and to get what I call untwitchy, because you know you're on the cell phone, you're on the computer all the time. I don't have any of that up there. So it allows me to clear out, to see, and to hear differently.
Thanks. And just, do you mind if I ask you just 2 follow-up questions since they kind of flow? One was, did you feel as if you had enough social connection to inspire your art? And then the other is, this reminds me of a poet I've been researching this past year, John Haynes. Was he one of the poets? Or he was a poet and artist, and he lived in Alaska, and he homesteaded for almost 30 years. So I was just wondering if he was one of them.
So the first question was, did I have enough social life to sustain my art life? I had a cat. And then when the cat was gone, I'd had a little dog, and then eventually 2 little dogs. So no, I had no social life up there. The social life is when I went down to Chester's Thriftway Market to go grocery shopping or to the library. But, you know, being an artist, you're isolated in your work anyway. But no, I didn't have any critiquing literary society at the end of the day to talk about my ins and outs of my work. And what was the other question?
It was those 2 about John Haynes. Who were some of the artists that did inspire you?
Well, it was interesting. It's in, I think it's in the second book, or no, it's in the 3rd book that's coming out. Everybody was comparing my work when I was in art school to Georgia O'Keeffe, and I had never seen Georgia O'Keeffe before. So I got a book of hers, and I looked at hers, and I went, not really. But the artist that really did inspire me was the Canadian artist Emily Carr. Are you familiar with her? Yeah. British Columbia, yeah. And she was kind of like me. She'd take a little trailer out in the woods with her monkeys and her dogs and paint, and then go back to Victoria and try and sell her work. The other artists that really inspired me is like Charles Russell and Remington. So I would study them. And again, you know, there was no cell phone, there was no television. It was books by kerosene lamplight or on the porch.
And then I had 2 questions for you. So one is, did you feel when you moved to a more populated area that you had enough like internal space, you could create enough internal space to pursue your artistic work? And well, go ahead and I'll just.
That's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked that before. It was very challenging. So I'm from rural eastern Montana, Sydney, which is big. My mom calls me a town kid because she's from even smaller than that. She went to a 1-room schoolhouse, kinder through 8th grade, in the country. And so when I moved to Austin, which is where I live now, I missed space. So I was going to go for a drive because I like driving in Montana. Either I'd be in the wilderness. And it took me a really long time, and there was no getting to any empty space. So I finally found like a small road and went to some Czech grottos that were built there. It is harder, and I find I write best still in just one small place in my house. That's like an upstairs closet that feels smaller I can attach to, but I write often when I'm home. So I found like my first novel I wrote when I was traveling in Greece by myself, or here in the summers, or in airports. I think in places where I can feel like I'm not connected to anything is probably my easiest writing time. Yeah.
Thanks. So I was just wondering about how do you view yourselves kind of as like radical environmentalists or moderate environmentalists, or don't you really think about that much? Because I guess the reason that I'm asking that is because when I think of like people living off the grid, usually I find that that's why they have done it, because they wanted to be more in touch with nature, get away from like a consumer culture or, the military industrial complex. But I feel like that's when I talk with people, their primary motivation for kind of going off grid.
Well, I consider myself a conservative liberal. But I didn't go off the grid in rebellion or to seek back to the land movement experiences. I needed a home. My parents had died when I was a kid, and I needed a home. So I said, okay, well, I'll just go build one. And actually, it was through that and prior Girl Scouts that gave me my awareness of nature. I am not a radical. I don't advocate some of the stuff that PETA does, but I am very conservative when it comes to how we manage our forests. And that has actually changed a bit since the fire seasons. I've had 5 fuel load reduction grants. And fuel load reduction means you take the ladder, fuel ladder out of your environment. So I've spent probably 15 years maintaining that property, falling trees, bucking them up, getting all the slash down, and have seen that because up above in the wilderness, they did not allow the natural fires that actually the Cayuse Indians did, hundreds in the 1800s. They did not allow that. In 2015, there was a massive fire up there, and it literally burnt to my property line. Had I not been up there the day that it started and saw some fire officials coming up, and if they had not put hoses on my cabin, I wouldn't have a cabin. So in that sense, like when I walk through the forest, I like reed trees. I mean, oh, you need to go because you've got beetle disease and you need to get thinned out here, and we need to get this off the ground here. One thing that really does rile me is when I see clear cuts. I don't advocate clear cuts. That's not a good forest practice. It's not, growing trees is not like growing corn.
For me, my personal feelings about the environment, I think, would be stronger and more similar. But the book itself, the main character's parents left for a reason that is similar to a homesteading book I was reading, which I think kind of the play in the book is taking things that are inherently good, right? Being more mindful about what you eat is inherently good. Disconnecting and not believing everything you hear is a good thing, but that her parents have skewed that in a way that's unhealthy. And it reminded me of, in preparation for this, was reading about homesteading, and in the intro to the book, the author was talking about how she had moved out to live on a farm and make her own food, and her friend had as well, and they started receiving letters from people who did the same. And suddenly, all of these women were able to have babies when previously they were unable, and people who had diseases that were cured. And it reminded me of when my husband was going through cancer treatment. I was at like a spa place in Austin, and a woman was talking about a farm in Vermont, and how this face cream she was going to give me for $300 would cure cancer and had cured cancer. And I got so angry, not to her because I'm a polite Eastern Montanan, but in my head I was furious because I thought, wow, you really need to send this lotion to MD Anderson, the chemo hospital in Houston, because if really a face cream is curing cancer, this is incredible. And so it was that lie within a truth that I really wanted to play with in this book, because yes, I do think there's very powerful things about removing yourself and being in nature and taking care of land and taking care of your body, but people can turn that in a way that's really unhealthy. And that's like her parents have scared her about food and scared her about water in a way that takes a truth and turns it ugly.
Thanks. And just in a more specific way, I guess, just that phrase "off the grid," I feel is very reflective of the like the energy grid, that in its most literal way, it's like people kind of disconnecting so that they don't have traditional means of creating power. Like with utility companies generally give us power if we're in the cities or suburbs. And sometimes you have, I guess, if you're independently living in the country, you'll have generators. And it seems like we're kind of at a turning point in America with that. Do you feel that going forward, if we all get to be off the grid or decentralize, how do you think that's going to influence like artistic trends in an American literature and art?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's possible to totally go off the grid. In a utopian vision, if you went off the grid, you'd probably have a lot less artists working all night long because you need the light. I mean, when I work at the cabin, I work and live by the light up there. And if you went off the grid, does that mean you're not generating electricity to run your computers? I don't know. That's kind of a wide question. But I want to go back to one question you said, did I have any like social life, any people to support me? So this really interesting thing happened to me, it was 7 years ago when the forest fire happened. When I was 18 and living up there, I would write letters, right, and keep my journals. Well, I wrote this letter to Ms. Magazine. Everybody know Ms. Magazine? To this editor that said, I'd like to write an article about me building this log cabin. Well, this led to this like 3-year exchange between this editor and I. I'd send her my journals, she'd read them, she'd critique them, we wrote back and forth. She was like my savior. She was the person I connected with while I was being alone for 10 days up at the cabin because you're snowed in. Well, in 2015, I get this letter from a filmmaker in Santa Cruz. It says, we have this letter you sent to the Ms. Magazine in 1975. And she's doing a documentary on people that wrote letters to Ms. Magazine, and they picked mine out of like 40,000 letters. And so she came up and she interviewed me, and this interview went into this documentary called Yours and Sisterhood. So kind of the moral of the story is watch what you put out there because it might come back.
Thinking about like the technicalities of off the grid, I currently live in Texas, and you may have heard, so 2 years ago, Texas has their own grid. So that's kind of the big thing. They have said no to the United States power grid. We are going to be on our own. And it collapsed. We were 38 seconds away from total collapse of the electrical grid in 2020. Where we would not, it would have been months where no one in Texas would have had power. Personally, we went 84 hours without any power. The temperature was in the 30s, so my bedroom was 38 degrees. Our neighbor, thank God, who is in his 80s, our other neighbors were able to get him to a hotel that was on a grid. And so when I think about that independence, the danger of it, because that's again where I'm thinking, is that you lose a sense of community. So in Texas's stand to be off on their own grid, they lost connection and were unable to sustain it. So if everyone went off the grid, I think you'd have to be really intentional about how you build community and connection, because like in this story, when her family goes off the grid, they separate themselves from family members, from those connections that could have supported them along the way. And it's very difficult, like as Yvonne shows in her book, and as I learned through research, it is very, very difficult to live off the grid. There's tons of people with YouTube videos now, but to grow enough food for yourself and a family is incredibly hard work. To generate your own power, to get water from the river, and to do that for a family is something that would be a real challenge without a community. And so for art especially, I think it would be incredibly difficult to sustain that.
Thanks, you guys. Does anyone else have any questions? I could come around with the mic, or you could just blurt them out. It's funny, I just moved to Hamilton from Sacramento, and so I have, just kind of some intersections with off the grid as a topic. My ex-husband in Sacramento, he was a mechanical engineer for SMUD, the local utility, and he kind of went from, being a kind of modern hippie engineer, like, creating his own biodiesel, and we had our own way of like drying food with a solar dryer, and we tried to do an urban garden and live really sustainably in our urban space. And now he's more about creating really efficient energy systems for the city of Sacramento. And Sacramento actually has a great independent this utility because it's I think the only one in the country where we had two nuclear towers built in the 70s, and you could see them just from outside the city, and the citizens by vote of Sacramento County shut them down. And so I think they're the only two nuclear reactors in the United States that got shut down by like consensus vote. So it's kind of a public utility with this like radical past is the way I think of it. But anyways, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but okay. And then I just recently moved up to Hamilton, and one of the selling points of Hamilton for me is that it's really focused on local businesses. So not so much where people are, growing or creating everything themselves, but for example, I guess Walmart tried to move into Ravalli County twice, and people, I wasn't there then, but people just said this, like the people in Ravalli County went crazy. Like they were not going to let Walmart stay. And so it left. And then Kmart left. And now the downtown, it's like such a functional downtown still. Like there's some boutique stores creeping in, but it still has 2 furniture stores you can walk to and buy all the furniture you need for a house. And so I felt like that was a great example of a community that still really valued local businesses. So a step away from off the grid living, but kind of in that medium place. Yeah. So any questions? Go ahead.
Did you say it was fiction?
It is, yes. Yeah, mine is young adult fiction.
I remember reading a very similar story of nonfiction.
Yeah.
You felt that very
Well, I will be presenting at 2 o'clock in the room over there. I've got a PowerPoint that actually shows the cap, B18 buildings of cabin, and what it's like today. So I hope you all can come and take a look.
All right, thanks. Thanks, you guys. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for coming.